examination of the evolution of oboe part writing throughout music history. Throughout Western music history, the oboe has served as one of the primary members of the orchestra. From its beginnings in the Baroque consort to the modern-day orchestra, the instrument's story is one of unique ups and downs between being a celebrated staple and being a burdensome necessity. Though the instrument has weathered much through Western music history, it has endured and evolved into the instrument that is so familiar today. What is not familiar, however, is the progression that the oboe took to get to its modern iteration. The modern oboe represents years of development, both technologically and musically, on the part of oboists, instrument makers, and composers alike. This lecture aims to expose this progression, showing the changes that both inspired and absorbed for the oboe within the framework of Western music history. The first documented usage of the oboe was in 1657 at the French court under Lully. Lully introduced the oboe as an eventual replacement of the sham, participating in the same role in the consort, playing marches, dance suites, and ceremonial music. Very early on, the oboe began picking up theatrical connotations, as Lully used them frequently on stage during pastoral scenes. It was common to see oboes used to help represent a simple and innocent shepherd's life on stage, a representation of peace, to contrast the trumpet, for example, which was a personification of glory, heroism, and battle. The doctrine of affections, a theory in the Baroque period that music could evoke specific emotions depending on instruments used, keys, musical figures, etc., refers to the oboe as a sweet instrument, effective at imitating the voice and prone to displaying cheerful and joyful emotions. Despite this association with peace and the pastoral, the oboe was quite loud. In fact, the term hautbois in French literally means loud wood. With the ratio of oboes to violins varying anywhere between 1:1 to 1:11. In the Baroque ensemble, violins and the oboes were partners in all things, often doubling lines or performing similar leadership functions for their respective groups, strings for the violins for the strings and oboes for the winds. An example of this can be found in the manuscript of Handel's Judas Maccabeus. With the top two lines being oboe parts and the bottom two being violin parts, it is easy to see the correlation that these two instruments had with each other, as the first oboe and first violin parts nearly double each other. Interestingly enough, the oboes also provide a doubling to the sopranos in the oratorio. This association with the human voice is what began the oboe's extensive Baroque solo repertoire. According to Geoffrey Burgess and Bruce Haynes, this was what the oboe did best, and the reason that it had been created, to convey the emotional force of words and to move its listeners. Much in the way that violin was dominating as a soloistic instrument, the oboe quickly captured the ear of many composers. One such composer was Tommaso Albinoni, who wrote several concerti for the oboe during his lifetime. Albinoni is an interesting case, as he wrote both operas and instrumental works simultaneously throughout his career. From the perspective of this lecture, this puts him in a perfect position to either confirm or reject the notion of correlation to the human voice. While arias and concerti in the Baroque period share much in common, including a basic ritornello format, they are still separate genres for the most part. The oboe concerti of Albinoni, however, differ from the concerti from other instruments in that they do emulate a vocal aria structurally. John Soli, in an article for the Musical Quarterly, writes, "The concertos with oboes, however, begin in a way which suggests that Albinoni may well have had arias in mind when composing them. Were the voice in his elaborate orchestral arias replaced by an oboe, the music from the beginning through the ritornello in the dominant key could not be distinguished structurally from the oboe concertos of Opera 7 and 9. While other instruments struck out with their own timbres, the oboe retained a strong connection to the human voice, a connection that we will see later extends far into the 19th century. Of course, much like a Baroque aria, it was expected that the concerto instrument also ornament the piece, bringing the performer to the table as a creator as well as a vessel for the piece. Here is a fragment of a violin concerto by Albinoni. It is clear that Albinoni did not write any dynamics or articulations in the passage. While the articulations can be found in other parts of the same work, no dynamics exist in the piece, common with many other composers at the time. Therefore, it was up to the performer to determine what dynamics, articulations, and embellishments to use. Keeping the harmony in mind, it was considered appropriate to add mordents, trills, and even turns and passing notes. This remained true for orchestral music as well, as evidenced by the Handel fragment before. There are no dynamics or articulation marks whatsoever, suggesting a similar attitude toward the performer as more than just a vessel. In order to demonstrate one such possibility for an aria-style embellished concerto, I shall now play Albinoni's Concerto in D major, Opus 7, number 6. As this piece is incredibly repetitive, inspired as it is by vocal arias of the time, I've elected to make extensive usage of passing tones and turns throughout the main melody of the piece. Additionally, I've used mordents and inverted mordents, more often than trills, in order to keep a sense of lightness through the piece. Conventions of the Baroque period did not disappear overnight with the death of Bach and the beginning of the classical era. Instead, the classical era reinforced much of the oboe's previous connotations with symphonic works. With the expanded orchestra of the 18th century featuring the oboe at any time suddenly became more of a difficulty due to the changing technology of the instrument. According to Bruce Haynes, although the classical oboe looks at first sight like a Baroque oboe, its smaller bore and tone holes represent a sharp break with the past. It was this smaller bore that led to a significantly tamed sound produced by the oboe. Haynes characterizes it as narrow and more focused, and softer, especially in the upper register. The changes in the oboe's technology were likely brought about by changing attitudes toward the instrument, noted by the introduction of the clarinet. In fact, Haynes points out that Mozart himself considered the clarinet a direct replacement for the oboe, especially as it was a doubling instrument for oboists as it was introduced. He writes, By the end of Mozart's life, the clarinet was on at least equal footing with the oboe. As the popularity of creating an even tone color throughout the orchestra increased, the dominance of the oboe, and in particular its partnership with the violin, began to fall out of place. This was brought upon by the compositions of Johann Stamitz, who founded the Mannheim School of Composition. Stamitz was the first to begin writing independent parts for the oboes in his symphonies, rather than following the violins. By the height of the classical period, the correlation between the violin and the oboe had all but fallen apart, as violin parts increased in complexity, while the oboe parts began to take on a more harmonic function as a whole. The oboe was not without its shining moments in the orchestra, however, as the oboe had a near monopoly on the pastoral and dance from the previous era of music history. It was still often used as such, as evidenced by its extensive usage in movements such as Haydn's 96th Symphony, Movement 3, or Beethoven's 6th Symphony, also titled the Pastoral. Beethoven, however, took the storytelling capacity of the oboe and added a new dimension to it, that of speechless grief. This small move by Beethoven, rather unprecedented in any work leading up to it, sent shockwaves throughout history that still resonate today, as we will explore later on. In the opening of the second movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony, Eroica, we are treated to a funeral march, as is marked in the score itself. After an introduction by the violins, the oboe has this now famous solo. As can be clearly seen, the first edition contains numerous specific directions to the musician, such as dynamics here, and articulations marked here. This became common in printed music at the time, in contrast to the previous era. First, however, we must address the growing issue of surrounding solo repertoire for the oboe. Despite the oboe's popularity in the Baroque period, the oboe began to lose favor among composers for new works. Haynes writes for Grove, despite the popularity of these forms, the quartet and the quintet, the quantity of new compositions for solo hautboy was on a steady decline in the second half of the century. In fact, the oboe's lack of repertoire is most prevalent in the concerto genre, where only the Mozart Oboe Concerto, Köchel designation 314, survives as the only piece written by a major composer in the time period. The concerto, in classical sonata form, was originally written for the oboe. The majority of the manuscripts are now lost, but it was later transcribed for the flute. The sonata form has ancestry in the binary of the ritornello used by Albinoni's concerto, but despite this ancestry, there is little in common between the two pieces, especially with how they were written and intended to be played. Firstly, we can see an amazing jump in virtuosity for the oboe, with very complicated rhythms and notes extending above C, above the staff. Mozart composed this concerto for the oboist Giuseppe Ferlendis, the principal oboist at Salzburg, but the Mannheim oboist Friedrich Ramm made it his warhorse. Ramm continually impressed Mozart with his virtuosity, and especially his range on the oboe. The Mozart Oboe Quartet was likely written with Ramm in mind, as Mozart continually uses E, E-flat, and F above the staff throughout the piece. Given the range of most parts written for the oboe at the time, it is highly likely that Ramm was the only oboist able to play the piece for quite some time. One thing that was held over from the Baroque to the classical era was the oboe's connection to the voice, though it was significantly weakened. Because of the open tone hole nature of the instrument, the scales of the instrument were uneven. This unevenness was used to give the effect of singing a scale using different vowels for each note, by composers, Mozart included. Moving past the virtuosity of the piece, we can see the clear division between the Baroque and the classical in the composer's direction of the piece. Gone are the ambiguous dynamics and articulations, as shown in this facsimile page from the third movement. Here we can see clear directions to the oboist for piano and forte, different dynamic markings. We can see articulation markings very clearly here, and also one other interesting point are trills and grace notes, ornaments that beforehand would have been used by the oboist himself, just making it up as he goes along or deciding what to do beforehand. In this case, it restricts the oboist far more and relegates the oboist instead into a vessel as well as being a contributor. One change between the concerti of the Baroque era and the classical era was that they had an addition of the cadenza movement at the end, where the orchestra hovers on a dominant pitch before the oboe provides the development to the resolution, free of any restrictions by the composer, save for the starting and ending key areas. To demonstrate these changes in the solo repertoire, I will now perform the exposition of the Mozart Oboe Concerto in C major, Köchel 314. introduction of the Romantic era to Western music meant a strange dichotomy for the oboe. On the one hand, the technological changes to the instrument were at their greatest, eventually morphing into the oboe that we use today. On the other hand, however, the solo and soloistic repertoire became even more limited than it had been in the classical era. The main impetus for the changes in the oboe were from the symphonic standpoint, as the demands of early 19th century exceeded the capabilities of the classical oboe. By 1830, in fact, each of the orchestral woodwinds had keys to give a complete chromatic scale without excessive use of fork or half fingerings. It was during this period that experiments began to form and various instrument makers began to deviate from each other in the most extreme ways possible. Robert Howe writes about the unpopular but influential Böhm system oboe. Playing experiments show that these oboes are loud and bright beyond what modern taste can accept. Their timbre is the antithesis of Berlioz's fragiline. While the Böhm flute became standard, oboists struggled to find a balance with the loud and brash Böhm oboe and the limited Tribert System 3 and System 4 instruments. It was only much later that, following the innovations of Loret, Tribert, and Barrett, that the oboes popular today began to emerge. The differences between these oboes quite clear as time goes on. Here you can see that the System 3 on the left, and System 4 use open hole fingerings, which is a holdover from the classical era. They also use crossed fingerings, as can be evidenced by the G key here. It's very difficult to see, but there are two holes instead of just one or a key. Moving further down the line, the next one, the Bern oboe, uses a complete system which is closer to what we use today and was later adopted by the System 6 and the Conservatoire model. However, it is shorter in length and wider in bore than any of the other ones here, making it a much louder, sharper sound. It also added some of these extra keys on the side here, the B flat, left A flat keys that are used today. Later on down the line, the Tribert System 6 added hold keys, keys that actually have small holes in them to improve the resonance and even out the scale. And also introduced the half hole here in order to help facilitate going up an octave easier. And lastly, the System Conservatoire, the system that we use today, invented in part by Loret, adds vent keys and trill keys that help even it out even further into the oboe that we use today. With the rapidly changing technology of the oboe, it would stand to reason that some of the instrument's previous connotations, held over all the way from the Baroque period, might have been lost. That's not the case. Instead, the influence of Beethoven loomed over much of the 19th century and brought similar writing for the oboe. Burgess and Haynes write, in the symphonic realm, Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony exercised a decisive influence on the pastoral of the Romantics. This sort of influence can be easily seen throughout the Romantic era in pieces such as the third movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. Berlioz himself wrote in his treatise on modern instrumentation and orchestration, "Candor, artless grace, soft joy, or the grief of a fragile being suits the hautboy's accents. It expresses them admirably in its cantabile. A certain degree of agitation is also within the powers of expression, but care should be taken not to urge it into utterances of passion. The rash outburst of anger, threat, or heroism, for then its small, acid, sweet voice becomes ineffectual and absolutely grotesque. The theme of a march, however manly, grand, or noble, loses its manliness, its grandeur, its nobility, if an hautboy deliver it." Berlioz's placement of candor and artless grace on the oboe's characteristics falls right in line with the Baroque idea of the oboe's pastoral quality, that of an innocent shepherd. Beethoven's reach certainly extended further than just the pastoral. As was mentioned earlier, Beethoven's Third Symphony made waves that resonated throughout the Romantic era. Burgess and Haynes write, "Oboe solos such as the Funeral March of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony continued to occupy the thoughts of those who dreamt under their boughs." Though the initial idea of using the oboe for the march may have come from the Baroque traditions of oboes playing ceremonial marches, the resultant effect was that the oboe had been forever linked to the idea of melancholy, a sort of quiet and speechless grief. This was further supported by Burgess and Haynes, as they note the usage of the oboe throughout Wagner's Lohengrin. The character Elsa sings "My Unfortunate Brother" to the falling line of her leitmotif in unison with the oboe. Unspeakable loss is given verbal form. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Wagner also used the oboe with Elsa to show the romantic ideal of Sehnsucht, or intense longing. Elsa's fantasized desire, first represented by the disembodied sound of the oboe, becomes manifest in the person of Lohengrin. Just as her voice is amplified by the oboe, Elsa is herself fulfilled and transcended in the person of Lohengrin. Though most scholars, and indeed most composers, view the oboe as being against romantic ideals of expression, it enjoyed a special place within the orchestra, even being noted by Richard Strauss as no other instrument could reveal the sweet secret of love's innocence in such affecting tones. The technology of the instrument at the time, however, meant that the affecting tones needed to be about the only thing playing at the time. By the mid-19th century, the oboe had lost the dynamic power of the oboe, rendering it unsuited to military and ceremonial music, while in the orchestra it fought a losing battle against the increasing power of the brass and string sections. Truly, the oboe was fighting forces it could not possibly compete against for much of the 19th century, forcing composers to either ignore it or treat it with extreme care in their orchestration. Cantabile became the oboe's characteristic mode of expression, according to the French oboist Henri Brault. Great composers use the oboe soloistically, only in melodic passages, and most often in slow tempos. This can be easily seen in one of the most famous romantic oboe solos, the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, shown here. Here we can see the complete quieting of orchestral texture in order to let the oboe sound be heard. As you can see, the strings are the only thing playing besides the oboe line up here, and they're doing a simple piano pizzicato on the beginning of every measure, and that is all, leaving the remainder of the empty bar space for the oboe to resonate alone. Because the oboe was seen as too quiet, it was often seen as limited, especially in solo genres. That few prominent composers produced solo or chamber music for the instrument was perhaps due in at least part to the limited range and expressive capabilities of the oboe relative to other instruments. It was considered unequal on its own to the aspiration of romantic expression. To truly understand the lack of soloistic oboe works in the 19th century, we can turn to Joyce Ann Sadorski in her study of 19th century oboe works. She writes, "Of the large number of major composers active during the 19th century, only Robert Schumann wrote solo literature for the oboe. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Burgess and Haynes offer this fact. The surviving solo and chamber repertoire for the oboe, up until the shift of the keyed oboe around 1800, or in the classical period, includes something over 10,000 pieces. These are works officially for oboe, works that mention the instrument, for instance, on the title page. To make matters worse for the oboe, it gained a reputation of being temperamental and difficult to play, leading many amateurs away from it. Most of the pieces written for the oboe during this time period were written by oboists themselves, usually for their own usage. In some cases, this can lead to less than desired results, as Sadorski points out. Much of the music of the 19th century is stylized, written in theme and variation form on an operatic or patriotic airs, and having questionable music value. The pieces appearing during this time for the oboe are highly specialized, meant for virtuosic playing at every level, with most pieces using the full range of the oboe, up to a high G above the staff. During the latter half of the century, the technicality of the pieces diminished significantly. This is perhaps due to the diminishing power of the virtuoso. While the oboe was increasingly ignored in favor of more popular instruments such as the clarinet and the flute, and even these were not as popular as string and piano combinations, the traveling virtuoso oboist became all but extinct. The amateur oboist was a rare animal indeed, though amateur musicianship in the Romantic period was flourishing with the rise of a wealthier middle class and less expensive instrument production process. Due to the oboe's reputation, even the most notable composition for the oboe, Robert Schumann's Drei Romanzen, was marketed as equally playable on violin or clarinet, as a commercial precaution by the publisher to ensure sales. Drei Romanzen are very difficult to play on the oboe, as Schumann still applied his romantic ideal of long phrases that, in terms of breathing, do not particularly suit the oboe well. It represents a different style of virtuosity from the virtuosic ideas presented by many artists in the same period, despite the great range taken by the piece, as can be seen in the first edition, there it is, of the piece. The oboe is required to maintain very long phrases that run between forte and piano, while also traversing the range of the oboe between E above the staff and C sharp below the staff. While this can, to some degree, be considered virtuosic in a way, it exemplifies a simpler form of long, lyrical phrases consistent with many of the Romantic era's ideals. In order to properly express the significance of this piece, I will now play the first movement, marked nicht schnell. began fragmenting in many different ways, the life of the virtuoso did not improve. Instead, as noted by Burgess and Haynes, the orchestra remained the oboe's principal arena of activity. The availability and stability of orchestral appointments tended to draw musicians away from pursuing solo careers. This was particularly the case with oboists. Many things changed for music in the 20th century, but the role of the oboe within the orchestra did not change all that much. It retained its association with the pastoral and retained much of its association with dance movements, shown in pieces such as Ravel's Tombeau de Couperin. Also, according to Burgess and Haynes, the association of treble double reed instruments with melancholia, dejection, and alienation continues through the modernist period. The greatest changes of the period truly come out in the solo literature, where the oboe experienced a sort of reawakening. Nora Post writes in her article for Perspectives of New Music, "For reasons of interest primarily to the specialist, the oboe was, for the most part, overlooked as a solo instrument during the 19th century. In contrast, the 20th century has witnessed the development of a sizable solo and chamber repertoire. While the technical demands made by many early 20th century composers were fairly conventional, others sought deliberately to transgress the boundaries of the idiomatic. Though the oboe saw a little lull in the virtuosity of the 19th century toward the latter half, the reawakening was caused by virtuosic oboe players, for whom many of the pieces were written. The most notable would be Leon Goossens, whose silken tone of his playing, his supple phrasing, and control of vibrato inspired numerous composers to write music for him. It is due to virtuosi such as Goossens that composers began to call on new and extended techniques for the oboes, such as flutter-tongue in Octandro by Varese, or a crescendo from piano 2 fortissimo in 3 beats. More prominently, the oboe concerto by Richard Strauss was found to be extremely challenging, even by the man who inspired Strauss to write it in the first place, Philadelphia oboist John Delancey. The connections between the previous eras of music history do not stop there, however. The Strauss concerto, though written well into the middle of the 20th century, is often considered to be a romantic work, at least in style, as it looks backwards to the golden age of pre-war Europe. With many of the movements of modernist music branching into neo-Baroque and neo-Romantic music, it is impossible to ignore the connections between pieces such as Walter Piston's Suite for Oboe and Piano, which is modeled after a dance suite, prelude, sarabande, minuetto, nocturne, and gigue, and many of the works and functions of the oboe in the Baroque era. Perhaps the most significant work written for the oboe in this era, however, is Benjamin Britten's 6 Metamorphoses after Ovid. The 6 short pieces each come with a small inscription on the top of the page to give insight into the character that the piece represents. As Burgess and Haynes point out, each piece showcases a different aspect of the oboe's character within a fascinating compositional metamorphosis. The pastoral is reflected in the first movement, Pan, whose inscription reads, "Pan, who played upon the reed pipe which was Syrinx, his beloved." The dance, and to some extent the pastoral, is represented in Bacchus, at whose feasts is heard the noise of gaggling women's tattling tongues and shouting out of boys. In the third movement, Niobe represents the oboe's melancholy aspect, who, lamenting the death of her 14 children, was turned into a mountain. These images cannot possibly fail to bring to mind clear connections between their subjects and the theatrical qualities the oboe has held onto throughout musical history. Also noting is the unaccompanied aspect of the works. While there are a few unaccompanied pieces for the oboe, this is the first major work that treats the instrument as being musically capable to stand alone with no accompaniment. I will now play 2 selections from Britten's Metamorphoses: Pan, who played upon the reed pipe, which was Syrinx, his beloved, and Phaeton, who rode upon the chariot of the sun for 1 day, and was hurled into the river Padus by a thunderbolt. Although the oboe had a very solid start in both the orchestral and solo literature, it is very plain to see that two types of oboes emerged throughout music history: the orchestral oboe and the solo oboe. Each type took a different path that ended very much in different places. The orchestral oboe began as a leader in the orchestra, rivaling even the violins. Soon after, in the classical era, we saw its power diminished as musical tastes pushed it toward a quieter and softer dynamic. Once the Romantic era was upon us, the oboe evolved into its current form and was easily overpowered, but highly prized for its ability to convey emotions such as love, longing, and grief. In the modern era, we saw little change, as the oboe maintained the same course it had begun in the Romantic era. The solo oboe began much in the same way as the orchestral oboe, as an equal to the violin and furthermore, directly compared to the human voice. It did not lose those qualities as it went into the classical era, though its importance began to wane. It waned even further for the Romantic era, where the sound, dynamic level, and the necessity to breathe made it more or less unsuitable for long and lyrical passages favored by the Romantics. However, it made a comeback in the 20th century as virtuosi such as Leon Goossens inspired composers to begin writing for the instrument again. Throughout both of these, the oboe maintained its relationship to the pastoral, speechless grief, and the dance, as evidenced by works throughout Western music history that exemplify this. It is a bit of a joke to say that when the oboe plays, someone has either died or fallen in love. But given the journey that we've taken today, it may not be as difficult to believe. Thank you very much.